Alright, so talking about abortion, I'm going to kind of think of where I'd like abortion to kind of head in the future now that we're going to have better Supreme Court justice in there and more state laws on restrictions on abortion may be held up. I thought I'd share with you, if I'm a legislator, where I think abortion law should head. So for many social issues, as many of you know, I'm very libertarian. For instance, I'm not against legalizing marijuana and regulating it like alcohol. But abortion to me is totally different. That's because abortion is not a social issue. It's a human rights issue. That's how I view it. In the United States Declaration of Independence, the great Thomas Jefferson wrote this. He said, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal and independent, that from that equal creation they derive rights inherent and inalienable, among these which are the preservation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Life, you heard it right there. That means the right to life is undeniable. It is a right given to us by God and which cannot be separated from us by man. So pro-choice activists, they like to argue that it is a woman's body and her choice. But it's not just her body. It's the baby's body as well, and it's that baby's rights we have to look at. It's not just their rights. We have to look at them both. So pro-choice advocates like to counter the whole right to life point that's in the Declaration of Independence by saying that the unborn are not humans and therefore they do not have these rights. Therefore, if we're going to move forward in this kind of debate, we have to come to a consensus as to when an embryo or fetus becomes a human. So this Ohio law pretty much says it becomes an embryo or a fetus becomes a human at the time of the first heartbeat. And I can agree with that, but it's probably something that a lot would disagree with. So we probably can get a lot further than that in a lot of states. That's 6 weeks. So that is why I propose that an embryo gets human rights at the start of the second trimester, which is week 13 of the pregnancy. At that time, just to let you know, the fetus has arms, legs, fingers, and toes. In fact, some are even sucking their thumb at that point, and also they're developing vocal cords. Now with that, if you look at a baby that's 13 weeks old, you can recognize it as a human. And I think the vast majority of Americans can agree that at this point in the pregnancy, that is a human being. Therefore, I propose a dual test. One for pregnancies before 13th week gestation and those 13 weeks or later. So before 13 weeks, I believe we should stick with the current test that was set in Planned Parenthood v. Casey in 1992, which pretty much affirmed Roe v. Wade in saying that a government may not pass laws that present the woman with an undue burden to get an abortion. Now with that being said, I think it's very important to narrow the definition of undue burden as it has recently been set out in Whole Woman's Health v. Texas Health Services decided this year, and that's the Texas one I talked about earlier, that ruled that admitting privileges and making abortion clinics live up to hospital standards an undue burden. To me, that is not an undue burden, and any regulation that looks to better the standard of care for women having an abortion, it is not an undue burden. And we're looking at the health of the woman getting it. They're actually having surgery, pretty much. You're having to put them to sleep and go into these women. So they should live up to hospital standards to me. That just makes sense. So I don't find that to be an undue burden. So I think, even though I want to keep that undue burden test, I want to narrow undue burden just a little bit. Now, so like I said, the undue burden test only applies to pregnancies before the 13th week. So by the 13th week, a woman knows if she's pregnant or not, and if she's going to voluntarily terminate, she should have made the decision by then. Now at the start of the 13th week, I think the fetus should be granted human rights, and just like before we terminate any other human's life, the fetus should be afforded due process. So what this would entail is a hearing by a judge who could decide on a case-by-case basis whether the pregnancy should be terminated. So the legislator can lay out certain instances when a judge can decide when to terminate to kind of limit it a little bit so the judge will have ultimate authority for everything. And they can limit his power. For instance, the legislator can rule the judge can only decide to terminate the pregnancy in cases of rape, incest, life of the mother, or life of the child, something like that. But I don't want to completely ban abortions after that because there are certain circumstances we have to look at, like life of the mother or whatever, that we just realities of life. So, but I think if that's going to be the case, a judge needs to look into it and decide what's on the kind of competing interests of the woman and the child. Just kind of balance. It's a balancing act, I think, at that point. Now, I believe an abortion law such as this can be accepted by most Americans. Of course, you're going to have the diehards on both sides of the issue who are not going to believe it. For instance, those who believe a one-cell zygote cannot be aborted or partial birth abortion should be allowed. Those people, they're not going to agree with it no matter what. Those I think, those are like your 20%, 10% on each side. What we need to look at is what 80% of Americans can agree with. And I think this is a solid middle ground that looks after the rights of the mother and of the unborn child. So what do you think of that test, James?
Look, there's a few issues that as Republicans and conservatives we have to look at and say, okay, are we realistically going to win this argument? Abortion is one of those issues, Matthew, that as conservatives, as Republicans, we can win this argument.
Okay.
The science behind this, once it becomes widespread, of course you're going to have those people, like Hillary Clinton, that think that babies should be aborted up until birth.
Yeah, it's partial birth of people.
Once I think people start to realize that this is in fact a life, I think they're going to look back on this time, Matthew, and maybe it's 20 years, maybe it's 10 years. They're going to say, I cannot believe that we stood by while we allowed for the genocide of 60 million babies since Roe v. Wade. So this is an argument that we could win, but I agree with you, there is room for compromise, right? Like whether it's 13 weeks, whether it's 10 weeks,
right,
whatever. However far back we bring that limit, because right now it's at like 24 weeks, however far back we bring that, those are lives that we're saving.
Absolutely.
But this is an argument that we can win. This is an argument that
and you mentioned that, especially the historical aspect, and we think about somebody like the Spartans who used to kill babies who weren't strong enough. If the baby had any kind of deformity, they would, they, of course they didn't have abortions back then, but the baby would be born, and then they'd kill it. Kind of like eugenics, kind of like some of Hitler type stuff, I think.
And we're seeing that around the world, right? Like
exactly.
Babies with Down syndrome, for instance, are much higher likely to to be aborted. I heard a great quote that I want to share with you right now from Mother Teresa. She said, abortion is a profoundly anti-woman measure. Why? Because 3/4 of its victims are women, half the babies and all of the mothers.